Hello, welcome to Local Matters. My name is Vicki Evans. People have lived in the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest for more than 11,000 years, and for about 10,500 of those years, there's no written record. It's the archaeological record that speaks for these ancient people and their cultures. And to increase our own cultural heritage, we need and we must learn to preserve and protect theirs. And today we're going to learn more about this as we welcome Bill Doley. Bill, thank you for being here. And Bill is the president and CEO of Center for Desert Archaeology. And Doug Gann also. Doug, thank you for joining us. And Doug is a preservation archaeologist for the Center for Desert Archaeology. Again, thank you both so much. Talk about the Center for Desert Archaeology. Who are you and what do you do?
Well, we're based right here in Tucson, and it's 13 people. Some of us are a little farther afield. We have someone up in northwestern New Mexico, but we try and accomplish something called preservation archaeology. And it's a research program. We've got a number of active research projects out here across the, as you said, the American Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. And we also put a lot of our efforts into public outreach, trying to get the information that we as archaeologists gather and share it with a much broader public. And finally, preservation archaeology involves an active stewardship. So we own a couple of archaeological sites and we're very concerned about their long-term preservation.
Why the focus on preservation?
Well, archaeological sites are non-renewable resources. The remains of 14th century village are being degraded over time. They're not being created again. So there's just a finite number of them out there, and there's a lot of threats to that archaeological record. There's erosion, there's modern development, and we have new techniques that we can bring to archaeology as we go forward. And so preservation gives us something in the bank that we can study in the future.
Doug, can you give us just a kind of a thumbnail? I mentioned 11,000 years and in habitation in our area here in Tucson, in this valley, and the San Pedro, along the San Pedro, the Santa Cruz rivers. Can you just give people a thumbnail, quick history sketch of who these people are and why we should be, we hear the word Tohono O'odham or Hohokam. I mean, how does all this fit in?
That's a pretty tough question to answer.
I know, and I want a thumbnail, no less, right?
There are so
just
many
to, kind of make sure, let
variables.
people know what's at stake here.
I think one of the really neat things about living in Tucson is living here. You're living in a place that has a really well documented 4,000-year history of human occupation. It may not be all in the same spot, but people have been living in this valley for about 4,000 years. And the best that we can see, some people moved in here about 4,000 years ago, and they were using corn, and they were learning how to make pottery. And those are sort of the essence of agricultural village life, and it seems to get started here along the Santa Cruz River, up near the Zuni area in New Mexico. But living here in Tucson, you're part of that 4,000-year continuum. And from those people who start out with some really crude pottery and some very scraggly corn plants, they fluoresce into this amazing set of cultures that we see across the whole Southwest. So we start calling them Hohokam after they really get pottery down at about 500 AD. They fluoresce and they grow up until about 1350, and then something happens. And by 1350, they're living in what you would think of as small towns, and with above ground architecture and nice pots. And something happens, and the populations diminish, and then around, say, 1500, the population starts to pick back up, and we call those people the O'odham. The O'odham are pretty sure that they are the descendants of the Hohokam. Archaeologists see a big break between the refined pottery of the Hohokam and what happens with O'odham villages. People take a step back in terms of not building really grand buildings. And then late 1600s, Father Kino shows up and describes these people living along the San Pedro and then in the Tucson Basin. And the Spanish move in with the military and the Presidio in 1776, and the churches at Santa Vera and at San Agustin, which is right at the foot of a mountain, around 1700, 1770 for San Agustin. The railroad shows up in 1880 and really changes everything, and you're on the track to a modern Western city.
Right.
But all of this is in the dirt, literally underneath our feet right now.
Right. And the preservationist part comes in, Bill, because it's not necessarily digging, correct?
Right. Archaeologists always have digging as an important tool, but what we at the center try and emphasize are lower impact, whether it's walking over the landscape out there and finding sites that haven't been recorded before, using surface mapping or surface collecting, or limited excavations, things that will leave a lot for the future. And so those are the kinds of techniques that we tend to use, plus mining old sources.
Historical sources, yeah.
Historical sources. And I think Doug mentioned the San Agustin Mission there at the base of a mountain, and those threats to the archaeological record didn't just start happening with the last few years with population growth.
Right, and maybe we can see, you brought some pictures, and we can see, is it the Convento? And is that the same thing as St. Augustine, and it was at the base?
That's part of that mission complex out there. So the two-story adobe structure that you've got on the screen there is the so-called Convento structure. There was also a chapel and other, actually a whole native village out there. And
so when was this built? Do you know, or about when?
Probably started construction around 1790, 1798, and
so this was a part of Father Kino then.
About
post Father Kino.
Post Father,
150 years after.
17. He was 16.
Right. And it was probably finished by about 1820.
Okay. And then we were seeing, and you, Doug, have worked on some computer generated pictures, really, of what the mission would have looked like.
Yeah. We lost the mission due to a trash dump being built on top of it, and a city brickyard, or not a city brickyard, but a commercial brickyard, sort of excavating the soil out from under the mission to make the bricks that went into things like the University of Arizona. So when the Rio Nuevo project sent archaeologists out to try and find the remains of the mission, there was very little left. There was one stone wall that sort of went around the building that was still there, and the mission's granary was still there, but the rest of the site had been lost. Fortunately, because the building existed long enough that photography could come into Tucson, we had a whole bunch of historic photographs of the building. And so we used some new tools that extract geometry out of photographs and built a 3D model of what the form and shape of the Convento would look like. And fortunately, the archaeologists found bits of plaster and exterior wall coverings.
So that's how you can look at this. That's how you created that.
Yeah.
What are we actually seeing there? We see the church, right?
You're seeing the church part. You're seeing the Convento in the foreground. The church had red walls, so the church is the next building over. And the church is pretty conjectural. The church collapsed before photography came to Tucson. So the only photographs we have of the church are of a big rubble pile out near the Convento.
Okay.
There was one painting of the church from 1854, and Adonassia Hughes, Sam Hughes' wife, wrote in her journal that the church had vermilion red walls. And we found pieces of that red plaster when the archaeologists went out to dig the site. And so that's where we got the red coloring for the church itself. But for the shape of the church, we really weren't quite certain. We had the one painting, but the artist painted a big tree in front of the church itself, so we don't know exactly what the facade
Darn that guy
of the
for
church.
putting in galley.
It was probably likely.
Probably was the only tree growing, and he wanted to capture it.
Well, it's probably likely that the church had already started to collapse when he made that painting. So putting a tree in front of the facade made it a little more believable of a painting.
I have to ask too, and I'm really showing ignorance here. Convento is what?
It's the residential structure there and this is somewhat of an odd structure, the two-story building. We're not entirely certain what the upstairs was used for. So we didn't solve all the mysteries of that building. But this is an example of bringing new technology. Doug actually was able to correct. The archaeologists had had a very short time on the ground out there before the landfill consumed the last little remnants of that site. And they made a sketch map, but it was wrong. And Doug's work with multiple photographs was able to show that no, it had to have been built in a different manner. And so this is going to give the City of Tucson something that will, it's not the detailed records, but it's a very high quality record of what was out there on the ground for reconstruction.
Right, and this is one of the Convento, or the, am I correct in saying Reconstruction? Because that's going to be rebuilt,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And it's one of the cornerstones, and work has started. I mean, that project is underway for Rio Nuevo and for development on the other side.
Yes. So
Historical park.
The Presidio work is the first step, and that's underway on the east side of the river, and then on the west side, the Convento and the chapel will be reconstructed as well.
And Center for Desert Archaeology, you've been quietly learning about these places, the Presidio Wall, and working with the City of Tucson, correct?
Correct. And again, Doug has been working on that component of the Rio Nuevo project, this visualization, trying to take the archaeological bits and pieces and make them much more tangible.
So as a preservation archaeologist, am I saying that properly? How would you describe yourself? How do you differ from the stereotype we see of Indiana Jones, or out there with this, and finding, mind you, the biggest gem that ever existed in the whole world? So have you guys found any of those gems? No. I just want to know what a preservation archaeologist does.
The whole Indiana Jones thing is really pretty damaging. Indiana Jones, as portrayed in these movies, is a looter, and that's exactly the sort of stuff that we're trying to educate people about. That looting damages sites, looting erases a whole host of people's history, and we're really trying to sort of get away from that sort of image. For me, I guess the most rewarding thing about doing preservation archaeology is going out to communities where they, either a private property owner or a city or a county owns an important archaeological resource, and going to that organization, that property owner, or that town government, and convincing them to do the right thing about the site, to take steps to make sure that the site is going to stay preserved. It's a tough sell, because preservation often means reburying archaeological features. But the really rewarding thing is when you spell it out for people and explain why it's important to save these places, why it's important to take these steps to make sure that these places that have lasted for 1,000 years are going to last for another 1,000 years, they almost always seem to jump right in and say, okay, yeah, you're right, this is something that needs to be done. And that's the best part of preservation archaeology.
It gets lost so quickly, in a generation, let's say. I mean, the grandfather might have known it was under the, there, but the grandson doesn't, It can be lost so quickly.
That community-based aspect of what we do is a really important element too. Doug was describing work up in the Springerville area, but we've been working, there's the pace of growth around this state is just tremendous. We're the second fastest growing state in the entire nation. And I think we've got a photograph of the area around Phoenix, that kind of growth that people are quite familiar with. They see this is actually, we're looking in the very foreground here at a very large village, probably several thousand people lived there at one point in the past. You're at the end, the little dot in the upper left of that photograph is an airplane taking off from Sky Harbor Airport. So the Hohokam culture was centered there in the valley where Phoenix has now spread, and almost stamped out all of that archaeological record up there for the Hohokam. To try and take advantage of what we know about the archaeology around the state. Our next photograph of a ball court out on the San Pedro River helps show the serenity of that part
And that's
of
a ball court,
Arizona
huh?
that we're looking in that foreground at a ball court. Probably dates about 800 to 900 AD. Had a ball game probably with a rubber ball played in that court. Villages would have gotten together and had a competitive game. But in that part of the Arizona, the modern population is probably less than the prehistoric population was. So there are still
Yes.
places where archaeology is well preserved, and those are the communities where we're trying to get out and get ahead of the development process.
Okay.
But boy, it's going fast.
It is going fast. And we are talking to Bill Doley and Doug Gann of the Center for Desert Archaeology. And if you would like to know more about what the center is doing and perhaps how you can help or learn about preservation, please contact the Center for Desert Archaeology, and that's 882-6946, 882-6946. Email center@cdarc.org. That's email center@cdarc.org. And of course, visit the website www.cdarc.org, www.cdarc.org. And with preservation, you also do, what are some other sites that you actually protect?
Well,
Because you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, we own some properties out on the San Pedro Valley, and we've also worked with landowners out there who have large parcels that have sites on them, and we have conservation easements that we hold on those properties. So,
What does that mean, a conservation
Well,
easement? Is it like a...
It's basically that landowner has given up to us a set of rights. That particular landowner can't subdivide his property any further, and they have the ability to only do surface modification in a very
kind of like the
limited
Nature
area.
Conservancy in a way.
We work both with the Nature Conservancy, and we use a lot of the same kinds of techniques
Right.
that they use to protect habitat and biological resources. And so now it's the center's responsibility to monitor that the resident complies with that easement and doesn't subdivide or doesn't damage. But it's an inexpensive way to protect archaeological sites over the long run.
Protecting these sites, which are, once lost, never gained again. How does that? Here I am, a citizen. How do I benefit from that? Am I going to be able to visit them? Am I going to be able to see them? I mean, I think I'm thinking
Yeah.
pretty short term, but many of us do that.
We try and take a balanced approach. Again, the example of Springerville is a place where a community actually owns the archaeological site. They have a museum. They have daily tours out 365 days out of the year. And so we've partnered with them to try and fill in some of the kind of expertise that's not readily available to them there in their community. These sites out in the very rural areas, probably very few people will visit those. They're difficult to access, and those are kind of in the bank and will be available for maybe future study, that sort of thing. So it's a balance. We're trying to get a mosaic of preserves out there across this entire southern Arizona landscape.
Well, I think that I was always surprised when I learned after living here in Tucson, and I think the Phoenix picture we just saw, the Phoenix with the, what is it, Casa Grande?
That's Pueblo Grande, and
Pueblo
there's a
Grande.
museum and interpretive facility there.
But that shot, that there really were a lot of these villages, and I mean, it's not like there was one or two in Phoenix and it's a long distance and two or three down here, right? I mean, it was amazing how extensive that was.
Hundreds of miles of irrigation systems there in the Phoenix area. And in fact, right under the runways at Sky Harbor Airport, there are still buried irrigation canals from the Hohokam. But again, the majority of the village sites have been stamped out by the modern development out there. So there's a huge loss in terms of potential future study of that information.
Right.
It's interesting, the continuity, because in prehistoric times, if you compared prehistoric Phoenix with prehistoric Tucson, you would have had the same sort of population dynamics. Prehistoric Phoenix was probably about 3 times as large as prehistoric Tucson. So you have to wonder with these systems of ball courts, you know, was there a Phoenix Basin, Tucson Basin rivalry going on? People made the same trek back and forth from Tucson to Casa Grande to Phoenix. It's just a real interesting sort of continuity.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So prehistorically, Phoenix was the big center.
Well, almost analogous to the historic development here in Tucson that Doug mentioned, the arrival of agriculture in the Southwest, and Tucson was thriving 4,000 years ago when Phoenix was really, the Salt River wasn't a very ideal place for these early farmers. So they're like,
That's
Tucson
amazing.
was the historic early settlement during the historic period, but fairly rapidly Phoenix started to grow both in prehistoric times and in historic
Why
times.
would you say that? Why is that, Bill? Is it because of the
It's a simple answer of water.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yep.
So that
Yeah.
ours isn't quite consistent enough,
And one of the questions, Doug mentioned that we see a disappearance of a large quantity of people on the landscape in the southern
Right.
Southwest, and starting maybe 1300 or so. And so you had that successful, there is almost over 3,000 years of very successful life here in the southern Arizona desert, and then all of a sudden, circa 1300 or so, that population starts to decline. And that's one of the, I think we have an illustration of a really simple, a pair of potsherds that maybe we could look
the pottery,
at on
right. So what are we seeing here?
Well, this work that we did out in the San Pedro Valley, basically it helped us tell time better. The sherd on the right, see the black line at the top?
Just
That
the
solid black
one,
line
right?
at the top. That's a very strong marker of the pottery that runs from about 1300 to 1375 or so. And on the sherd on the right, the scale's a little bit different, but you see that solid black line is down in the middle of the vessel, not up at the top of the rim there. That simple geometric change of having the black line at the rim versus dropping it down and having another design field at the top like that marks a change in the time out there. So
What change which way?
it's at 1375 or so that pottery on the right there started to be made. So by the work that we've been doing on the San Pedro, we've been able to go revisit collections and reclassify and reassess the dates that these sites basically shut off their lights and were abandoned. And what it showed us, instead of the original concept was 40 or 50,000 people disappeared just all of a sudden. Now we're seeing that as something that's happening over maybe a 150-year kind of time period. So much more subtle type of changes in fertility or more people dying through warfare or
that was what I was going to ask.
Or poor health.
And the climate, is that still a big factor in that era?
Well, there's information in the Phoenix area, for example. They've been able to use tree rings to from the mountain areas to project backwards what the stream flow would have been on the Salt River through the Phoenix area. And there were some very high stream flows in the 1350s, 1360s.
When this great kind of...
So flooding can be as big a problem in the desert as drought. And so there's a whole array of factors that could have caused things to be disrupted. And that's trying to piece together that story. Doug's right that we do have a hard time connecting the prehistoric material culture with what Father Kino saw at his first
How
visit.
interesting is that?
And
I just want to say too that you've got a newsletter, correct, and some materials that are available to people.
we try
And
and
I'm hurrying
get
because we don't have
this-
much time. I want to make sure.
We try and get this information out to a broader public, and it's a quarterly magazine called Archaeology Southwest. And
Very
it's-
nice. I happen to subscribe to this.
It's a part of our membership program. You get that by joining.
Right.
And the other thing that we offer is a daily or near daily kind of during the week. Southwest Archaeology Today is a email based. In fact, I'll let Doug explain how he compiles that.
It's just a
Oh,
quick.
do you?
It's
Yeah.
a quick daily summary of Southwestern archaeology in the news. Anything that has to do with archaeology, historic preservation, or anthropology in the general Southwest. We collect this off of news sources and send it out as sort of a daily index. So if you're interested in this topic, your subscriptions are free. You can sign up on our website, and we will send you updates as soon as we collect them.
All right. Just, we only have a minute, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
What would you like, how can people get involved? We've talked about, learning and participating in the programs you offer, but what would you like people to really remember?
This preservation archaeology message, everyone can be a part of that. I mean, when you walk in the rural parts of Arizona and see potsherds on the ground, leave them in place. Enjoy them while they're there, but leave them there, and certainly don't dig. There's a lot of value that
There's a lot of history in the soil, right,
Yes.
that we as even less than amateurs
Yes.
or would destroy.
So that message of leave it in peace, but enjoy it.
But
Take
enjoy.
lots of pictures.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. And Center for Desert Archaeology, preserving the past helps us to preserve, our own selves, our culture. Thanks. Thank you.
you.